Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the life of Thaddeus Stevens, who was a radical Republican who served in the U.S. Congress during the Civil War. He was perhaps the strongest voice within Congress, ensuring that the Civil War would be about ending slavery, and that the years following the war, he would be the strongest voice pushing for a fully integrated racial democracy. My guest for this conversation is Bruce Levine. Bruce Levine is a professor emeritus of history at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He has written a number of books of the Civil War era. His latest is called Thaddeus Stevens, Civil War Revolutionary, Fighter for Racial Justice. He joins us over Zoom. Bruce Levine, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you, Mitch Jeserich. It's my pleasure to be here.
I want to begin, before we get into the chronology of Thaddeus Stevens' life, which I do want to get into, but I want to begin about the big picture of how we remember Thaddeus Stevens. And I want to quote your introduction in your book, and you partially have a quote in this quote, so it's a quote within a quote. But this is what you say in the introduction. The hostile New York Herald sourly observed in 1868 that, quote, we are passing through a similar revolution to that of the French, one in which Stevens displayed the boldness of Danton, the bitterness and hatred of Marat, and the unscrupulousness of Robespierre. You know, for people who are interested in the French Civil War, to hear Thaddeus Stevens compared to those three individuals makes, and I don't know how accurate of a comparison that would be, but boy, it really sort of points to what a strong force that Thaddeus Stevens was.
Yes, I think Stevens at that point would have considered it high praise, although in his youth he had a different point of view about the French Revolution. But the New York Herald was not the only outlet to make that comparison.
And then it's interesting. I take that quote and I see it as kind of a real positive for Thaddeus Stevens. But it wasn't meant as a positive at the time. And in fact, the view of Thaddeus Stevens and the memory of Thaddeus Stevens was a pretty negative one. It wasn't really until the civil rights era that he would be kind of reconsidered, reimagined in who he was.
That's right. That's right. And that fact reflects what happens more or less beginning in the 1880s and especially the 1890s, as not only the South, which always hated Thaddeus Stevens if we're talking about the white South, but even the North turned away from the content, the legacy, and the honoring of the war that it had waged against the slaveholding Confederacy. It reflected the deepening conservatism of the Northern elite, who, after all, during the Civil War had largely backed the Republican Party, if not Stevens himself and his more radical wing of that party. Once slavery was abolished and the Northern economy's major challenger for control of the federal government had been eliminated, Northern business became very conservative and basically repudiated the struggle for equal rights, and certainly refused to put itself out for that struggle any longer. And culture follows power. So academics, novelists, popular historians, later screenwriters, all followed suit and portrayed Stevens as a villain. And as you say, it took the civil rights movement of the middle of the 20th century to make any substantial swath of cultural figures begin to reconsider that view. And as I say in the book, even John F. Kennedy vilified Thaddeus Stevens in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage. And he had undoubtedly learned that lesson while at Harvard, because that's what they were teaching at Harvard.
Yeah, you even have the quote that JFK used in the book Profiles in Courage, and I have it here. Thaddeus Stevens, he called the crippled, fanatical personification of the extremes of the radical Republican movement.
Yep.
So, again, he calls him crippled, and that's not just, I guess, incidental. Thaddeus Stevens, he was born in 1792 in Vermont. You'd become a congressman from Pennsylvania, and we'll talk about all of that. But a couple of things about his birth that are important to know. A, he was born in poverty, and B, he was born with a club foot, and that club foot would have had him limp his entire life. What I learned from your book, I did not know that his brother actually had 2 clubbed feet. Do you think that was significant?
I don't know for sure. I think it's very likely that that played a role, and a large number of writers have asserted that it did. Witnesses to his childhood said that his being baited on that score by other children hurt him. And I wouldn't be surprised if developing a sharp tongue and building up his own body as best he could was it, at least partly in response to the condition in which he found himself and the attacks waged against him by children on that score. What Stevens points to himself as an inspiration for his politics is not that, but the other factor you referred to, that he was born into poverty. And as an adult, he says that that fact gave him a sympathy and an empathy for the downtrodden in general. And I think that's quite likely.
And in that quote that you're talking about, he even thanks God for being born in that condition.
Right.
At least of poverty. You're right. He doesn't mention his disability, but he does mention poverty in that quote. Did he never talk about having a clubbed foot?
I have not seen anything of his in which he refers to that. Now, we have a problem on that score, saying what Stevens did and didn't say, especially about personal matters. One is, like Lincoln, apparently, he kept no diary, or at least we have no diary of his. So that possible entree to his inner life is not available to us. The second problem is, although we have a certain amount of his private correspondence, his handwriting was virtually illegible. And a number of his correspondents complained about that fact. And so you can today stare and stare and stare, and trust me, I have, at those letters without really being able to decipher them.
You can't figure it out.
So if buried in there someplace is a reference to his disability, I was unable to dig it out.
Oh, that's so you did try, though. You spent time.
Oh, yes. I've got the microfilm version of his papers, which run to many reels, and these eyes exhausted themselves trying to decipher much of that. And it's only the odd letter that lends itself to interpretation.
Again, Thaddeus Stevens would be associated with the state of Pennsylvania, which a district he would represent in Congress, but he was born in Vermont, and that seems to be an important point in your book about how perhaps being in Vermont and what Vermont was like in the late 18th or early 19th century may be important here. Also interesting to note, Vermont, a very old state for the United States, but not one of the original 13 states.
Exactly right. It's the 14th state. And it's mostly, it seems, New York State that kept Vermont out of the Union until a bit later. And that's because Vermont, as an independent entity, was really born in a struggle against first the colony and then the state of New York. New York was a region that contained these enormous manors dominated by or owned by political figures, politically powerful figures, who had hundreds and thousands of tenants who had very few rights. and the New York legislature bent in the direction of those manorial lords. That colony and that state attempted to cancel the land grants given to small New England farmers who had entered this region, given to them by New Hampshire, which also claimed the area. And so these small farmers had to wage a struggle, often enough an armed and sometimes bloody struggle, against landlords, would-be landlords, and land speculators from New York, so that small farmers could own their own land. And I believe that left a deep imprint on the political culture of Vermont. Furthermore, Vermont gives itself one of the very most democratic state constitutions in the country, and very deliberately, with a unicameral legislature so that it's difficult to effectively veto the desires of the population, short terms in office for the members of the legislators so that those who counter the wishes of the population can be more easily removed. Then, furthermore, that Constitution is the first one in the United States to frontally denounce chattel slavery. And that, too, helps to lay the basis for the political culture in which Stevens was not only born, but raised, because Stevens doesn't leave the state of Vermont until he goes off to college as a young man. So those are the values, it seems pretty clear to me, that surround him in his formative period.
I mean, we're talking more than 200 years later, but it is interesting to think that perhaps one of the most, if not the most radical member in Congress today is from Vermont, that being Bernie Sanders.
Right.
Yeah. Let's talk about Thaddeus Stevens as a young man going to Pennsylvania. Early in his professional career, he got into business, and he was also a lawyer. What's important to know about that?
Well, his experience as a lawyer clearly helps to shape his speaking ability. He is, judging from the records left both by his admirers and his critics, he was a very effective attorney. He could put in very few words exactly the point that had to be made in the courtroom, a skill that he carries into Congress, although in Congress often with many more words. And his investments yield him a great deal of money. I believe at one point he may be the wealthiest individual in the town of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And what's also, I think, interesting about that is that while he accrues that wealth, everyone who knew him to be an extremely generous individual. It took virtually nothing to get Stevens to give you whatever was in his pocket, and seemed to care very little about wealth for his own benefit. So this was somebody who believed deeply in the so-called free labor economy, what we would call capitalism, at least in its early stages. And that, I also believe, was part of the source of his opposition to slavery. But this was not somebody whose views were dominated by the desire to make money for himself. And when the principles that he espoused politically ran counter to the desires of Northern business people, he did not hesitate to break with them and denounce them for their avarice and for their bad set of priorities.
Yeah, his view on economics is interesting, and I think important, because you talk about free labor economics, which is that what they just basically referred to as capitalism at the time?
The free labor economy is what they generally called it.
Yeah. And this is fundamental to the rise of the Republican Party that would happen in 54 or 56 or somewhere around there.
It's hard to pin down. There are disputes over when it's actually founded. It's founded at the state level in a couple of places in 54. It holds its first national convention in 56.
And this
And yes,
free labor.
you're absolutely right. Free labor economy, again, what we would call capitalism, is central to the values, not only of Stevens, but of the Republican Party as a whole.
As I'm reading your account of his thoughts on the economy, I couldn't help but think, is this like an early version of John Maynard Keynes or someone? He wasn't anti-capitalist. He was pro-capitalist, but with a lot of caveats.
Well, yes. He was not an Adam Smithian capitalist. He did not believe, did not trust the invisible hand of the market. He believed in capitalism. We need to remember, however, that in his era, capitalism's scale of production was radically smaller than it is today. Substantial number of employers had themselves, in their earlier years, been wage earners. It's a form of economy which seems to still privilege smaller enterprise, and thereby, as its admirers pointed out, or at least cheered for, greater social mobility. Stevens believed in the essence of free labor economy, which he and others defined as the right of a legally free and legally equal man to enter into a voluntary agreement with an employer to be able to negotiate over the terms of that employment, and then hopefully eventually be able to accumulate enough wealth, eventually to become an independent producer and perhaps even a small employer himself. And they contrasted that, of course, very sharply with the slave labor system, in which human beings are actually owned by other human beings and owned for life.
Thaddeus Stevens would begin a career in politics locally in the 1820s and 1830s. He would serve in the state legislature before being elected, I think in 1860 to Congress, which is a really important election we're going to talk about. But before we get there, he seemed to, in his early political years, make his career, his political career anyways, on issues over education and also anti-Masonic. Anti-Masonic.
That's right.
Politics. Let's begin with education. He was very instrumental for the state of Pennsylvania of actually achieving universal education.
Yes. The outside of New England, the norm regarding education was not to put much, if any, public money into that area. Those who obtained education were generally the well-to-do, who did it with tutors or private schools. New England, where Stevens, after all, was born, had turned earlier toward the creation of so-called common, and we would say public schools. Pennsylvania embarked upon that road late. And as soon as the legislature passed a bill calling for the creation of public schools, opposition arose throughout the state among those who had a very narrow role of what the role of a very narrow view of what the role of government was. If I don't have kids who need an education, they said, why do I have to pay taxes to support this institution? And that was, in microcosm, part of a larger view that said, if this institution doesn't immediately and directly benefit me, why should I have to support it? And of course, that ran counter not only to the creation of the post office system, but a whole host of other services that people like Thaddeus Stevens believed strongly needed to be supported, whether they helped an individual directly who was paying taxes or not. And Stevens fought very hard to try to impress upon his own constituents the importance of educating the public, not least of all, to make them good citizens. And the kind of citizens he said to these well-to-do penny pinchers, good citizens who would learn to respect your rights and whose education would make it possible for you to flourish economically.
He was called the commoner. Where did that come from?
Well, it's an English phrase, and I've tried to track down its origins. So far as I can tell, it is a term of veneration for someone representing the common people, possibly coming out of the British Parliament, the lower house. I'm not sure about that, but I think it's possible. And so to call someone the great commoner implies the great leader, the great spokesperson for the common people.
Yeah, because it made, when you were describing all that, it made me think of the word, how the English use the word, the commons.
Exactly.
Of publicly owned and shared resources.
Right, but also the House of Commons.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Right. So my guess is it comes out of that, though, as I say, I'm not sure.
And his anti-Masonic politics. What was that all about?
Yeah, that took a while to dope out, I have to say. When I first read about this in Stevens' biography, that he belongs to a party whose primary aim is to undo the Masons, the Order of the Masons, I thought, what kind of a crackpot outfit was this? And why would a guy who becomes such a heroic figure in the struggle against slavery preoccupy himself with this kind of crank outfit? But the more I read about who the Masons were in those days, and the more I read about other members of the early young anti-Masonic party, the more sense it began to make. Because in those days, Masons generally included quite well-to-do people. Their membership in the Masons was usually secret. And what they secretly did was pledged to favor one another, both in economic activities and in political activities, favor them over any non-Mason. Well, this appeared to a number of people in the United States as a threat to the functioning of democracy and as a possible source of subversion of democracy. Because if you have this cabal operating among wealthy and well-placed individuals to arrogate to themselves economic opportunity and political post, you're dealing with something that quite reasonably seems a substantial danger. And this becomes even more pointed when a newspaper editor who is trying to expose the Masons is apparently assassinated by Masons. And this becomes a huge scandal and helps to ignite the anti-Masonic movement. And eventually, this party is successful in weakening the Masonic order and eliminating it as the kind of threat that it reasonably appeared at the time. To put this another way, the anti-Masonic party was a pro-democracy party. And so Stevens, as a believer in democracy, not surprisingly, finds a place for himself in that movement and in the leadership of that movement.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Bruce Levine. Bruce Levine is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He has written a number of books about the Civil War era, and we are in conversation about his latest that is called Thaddeus Stevens, Civil War Revolutionary, Fighter for Racial Justice. For our radio listeners, let me just tell you that there is also video of our conversation in which we use archival footage and photographs and these type of things. If you would want to see this and even share it, you can find it on our YouTube page. Just look for Letters and Politics and make sure you subscribe to that page so you know when we put up videos like this one. Bruce Levine, we've spent the first third of our conversation talking about almost everything other than the issue that Thaddeus Stevens, you brought it up a few times, but you know that Thaddeus Stevens is best remembered for, and that is his stand and his fight against slavery. When does this become the principal issue of his life?
He realigns his political life around the issue of slavery beginning in the 1830s. And that's precisely the decade in which slavery is most obviously beginning to move toward the center of the country's political stage. This is the decade of Nat Turner's revolt against slavery in Virginia. This is the decade when the modern abolitionist movement comes into being. This is the decade that's kicked off by Walker's Appeal, the call to abolition by a former slave and free Black individual in Boston that circulates throughout the country, including in the South, and causes a scandal among slave owners. This is also the decade in which South Carolina tries to nullify federal laws so that in the future, the federal government will not be able to pass an anti-slavery law that would prove even more hostile to South Carolina and its interests than the tariff that is the immediate focus of the attempt of nullification. So the North and the South come into collision over slavery in the decade of the 1830s. And Stevens, who had always despised slavery, but had never made it central to his politics, you can watch him step by step in the 1830s, beginning to re-examine the rest of his politics and the rest of his life with an eye toward making this issue central to his efforts. And of course, that becomes a national fact in the middle of the 1850s with the passage of the so-called Kansas-Nebraska Act, which threatens to open up a huge swath of the then very large federal territories to the expansion of slavery. And in the process, nullifies the so-called Compromise of 1820, which had excluded by law slavery from the northern half of the Louisiana Territory. Well, this nullification of the Compromise of 1820 inflames the North and lays the basis for the foundation of a party opposed to the expansion of slavery as its central goal. First time a major party in American history took that issue as its primary focus. And Stevens is one of the early joiners and early builders of that party in his state.
Was it true that the Underground Railroad would run underneath or, through his home in Pennsylvania and would even serve as a station?
Yes, there's testimony to that effect by a former fugitive, and archaeological finds in the business enterprise that he owned does indeed suggest that fugitives were hidden within its within its recesses. And he says in his correspondence, some of which we can read, that he is keeping a close watch on the allies of slaveholders in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And especially after 1850, with the passage of the new fugitive slave law that makes it easier to recapture African Americans who had managed to escape into the free North, Stevens is sending word through the grapevine of the African American community to tell fugitives to get the hell out of Pennsylvania and make their way into Canada, if possible, where they will be safer than they would nearby.
Was Thaddeus Stevens connected or have relationships with Black anti-slavery fighters, people like Harriet Tubman and others?
He has connections with local anti-slavery fighters, African Americans, and those are the people who constitute the grapevine with which he worked. He's also in 1851 an attorney in a case involving the flight of slaves from Maryland into the state of Pennsylvania, where their putative owner chases those fugitives down, confronts them, and tries to haul them back into slavery, whereupon the fugitives kill him, kill the Maryland owner, and then make their way further north. That comes to trial, and Stevens is an important part of the defense campaign. So that places him in the middle of an African-American involved struggle to prevent the strengthening of slavery.
Let's talk about his election to Congress in 1860 and what an important election is. This is also the election in which Abraham Lincoln is elected as president. And I don't think it's well remembered that the Civil War and the succession of states from the South actually begins after the election, but before Abraham Lincoln is sworn in as president. This is when they swear in a president in March. And Lincoln didn't campaign to end slavery. Sort of the platform, the Republican platform at the time was just to contain it, keep slavery where it was, but don't necessarily allow it to grow. And it's kind of odd, and maybe they didn't believe Lincoln, but, again, Lincoln didn't make ending slavery his principal issue. So it makes me wonder, in thinking about Thaddeus Stevens' election, were there other members of Congress that maybe scared the South more than maybe even Abraham Lincoln, like paying attention to somebody like Thaddeus Stevens getting into Congress and what that could mean?
Well, you're certainly right that Lincoln did not declare his intention to attack slavery where it already existed. Lincoln and the Republican Party believed they didn't have the constitutional right to do that the Constitution, and this was the prevailing view, the so-called federal consensus, that the federal government had no such right. But what people who eventually formed the Republican Party did believe was that slavery was a system that had to expand constantly in order to survive for a range of political, economic, and social cultural reasons. And therefore, the federal government could bring about slavery's death indirectly by preventing that precise expansion. The parallel that always comes to my mind is to a shark that has to keep moving in order to breathe. Slavery, both Northerners and Southerners believed, needed to keep growing, keep expanding in order to survive. Well, the federal government had direct control over the federal territories and had rights over the District of Columbia and over forts and arsenals scattered throughout the United States, as well, finally, as the coastal waters. And anti-slavery individuals wanted the federal government to use that power to ban slavery throughout that domain. And the Republican Party, at its formation, sets out to ban slavery everywhere in the federal territories. So that is seen by both Abraham Lincoln and the leaders of the future Confederacy as a mortal threat to slavery. In Lincoln's words, this is designed to place slavery in the path of its ultimate extinction. And that's something that, of course, the slaveholding leaders of the southern states will have no truck with. So there didn't need to be a Thaddeus Stevens to make them frightened. Stevens, who had even greater anti-slavery ambitions. Lincoln was bad enough in their view.
Let's talk about Thaddeus Stevens' role in the Civil War itself and the execution of the war. Thaddeus Stevens would play a very important role as being the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. Now, this is an important committee. It still is. It's still a powerful committee that never gets in the attention like a judiciary committee,
Right.
But the House Ways and Means Committee, this is the committee that is in charge of revenue and taxation. So he was the chair of the committee that was instrumental in funding the war.
Exactly.
How did he use his power to try to direct how the war would be fought and what the war would be about?
Well, Stevens is directly involved, just as you say, in making sure that the Union armies and the Union Navy get everything that they need in order to wage the war against the Confederacy. And Stevens' papers are filled with notes and correspondence from other branches of the government telling him, as the chair of that committee, exactly what they need and urging him to get that to them quickly, which he does. He's very good at his job. He's a skillful parliamentarian. He knows how to make that committee work. He's not alone in doing so, but he is the, as you say, chair of the committee. And that's one of the reasons that he's hated in the South, because it becomes well known that he is a key part of the engine driving the Union war effort. But Stevens also uses his position as chair of that committee, and by the way, as one of the key floor leaders of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, to help push through a series of other laws that don't directly involve finance, but that nonetheless prove key to the attack on slavery. The so-called confiscation acts, which don't necessarily originate in his committee, but when they reach the floor of the Congress, Stevens pounds away at the opponents of those measures. Confiscation acts that are designed to lay hold of the Confederacy's slaves and give them freedom.
His enemies would call him the dictator of the House of Representatives, or something to that extent, which I think is interesting to think about, because Thaddeus Stevens, you could say, was a leader of the radical Republicans in Congress, but the radical Republicans were a minority within the Republican Party itself.
Exactly
Yet,
right.
as a radical, as not really being in a majority, he still was basically calling the shots in Congress, which is really interesting to think about.
He is, to a degree, as he says later in life, yes, referring to the rest of his party, yes, I lead them, but not before I get public opinion on my side. And what's not often attended to is the degree to which Stevens, not only in Congress, is addressing his Republican colleagues and his Democratic Party opponents, but also speaking over their heads to try to reach the population. So newspaper editors reprint his congressional speeches, and then others reprint those speeches in the form of pamphlets that circulate sometimes in hundreds of thousands of copies, and are designed precisely to help accelerate the change of public opinion in the North, so that they will either permit or compel more laggard members of the Republican Party in Congress from endorsing the kind of measures that Lincoln and other radicals are supporting. And so it is, just as you say, that Stevens manages to ride two horses at once throughout most of the Civil War. He's a central leader of his party as a whole, but he's also perhaps the most articulate representative of its more radical minority wing. And it's one of the most interesting things, I think, about the Civil War and Stevens' role in it, that he and his radical allies managed repeatedly to put forward proposals that at first seem too extreme for the Republican majority, but then, because of the change of public opinion and because the requirements of waging the war against the South make it clear to the more conservative Republicans that these so-called extreme measures are necessary if victory is to be achieved.
He wasn't interested in compromise.
In general, he was certainly not interested in compromising with the South, and he waged a war against compromisers from the 1850s on. He was against the Compromise of 1850 that, by the way, Lincoln supported. And that cost him his early seat in the United States Congress. The Whig Party, to which he then belonged, refused to renominate him in 1852 because he had so vociferously opposed the Compromise of 1850. In 1860-61, when there was great pressure being brought to bear on the Republican Party to back away from its own platform, in order, it was hoped, to stem the tide of secession, Stevens fought very hard against the compromisers. Compromisers and their advocates, not only outside the Republican Party, but also within the Republican Party. But Stevens also was capable of seeing that under certain circumstances, there was no alternative to taking less than the whole loaf. So that when he's fighting, for example, for the 14th Amendment, and when he finds himself unable to convince the majority of the Republicans to go along with a more stringent version of that amendment, Stevens says, okay, almost literally says, I will not allow the perfect to become the barrier to the good. I will take what I can get in the struggle for equal rights and look toward the day in the future when better circumstances will allow others to get what more fully needs to be adopted. So he was not a rigid doctrinaire. He believed strongly in his views, but he was also a skillful tactician.
This is an important point because Thaddeus Stevens, somebody who's very instrumental in getting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the Reconstruction amendments that were really meant to enfranchise former slaves and Black Americans into civic life. Of course, it would take almost 100 years for those to have some teeth with the Civil Rights Act of the 60s. But he would have liked to have gone much further than what those amendments did.
Yes. Stevens believed that, among other things, what needed to be done was to put some property under the feet of the impoverished former slaves. Stevens believed that for them to genuinely enjoy equal standing in the country, both economically and politically, by the way, they needed to have land of their own. Now, he didn't make up that idea. The former slaves themselves were pressing hard for the idea that the plantations ought to be confiscated, broken up into small farms, and divided among the former slaves whose labor, after all, had made that land profitable and whose labor had, in many cases, provided the funds that made it possible to purchase that land for the slave owners in the first place. And so even in the Civil War, as soon as slave owners begin to flee in the face of advancing Union armies, slaves on those plantations begin to cultivate the land immediately in their own interests. So Stevens is basically taking his cue here from the freed people themselves and introduces a series of measures in the House of Representatives that would have done exactly that, confiscated the great estates and turned them into small farms for Black Southerners. The Republican Party will have none of it. This is where they draw the line, effectively saying to Stevens, we followed you on emancipation. We followed you on bringing Black men into the Union Army. We followed you in imposing Reconstruction in the South, though we were not happy about doing so. We followed you in almost removing Andrew Johnson from office. We will not follow you here.
That's where
we will not confiscate this private property.
Or over property.
That's right. Because while we don't believe property in human beings is legitimate, we certainly believe in property in land. And especially when the demands of peace, when the demands of war don't require it. Let me say that again. Especially in a time of peace, when the requirements of war don't require seizing land, we will not seize land. And he gets almost no support. Even some of his radical allies abandon him on this issue. And so he feels that is a great blow to what he wants to bring about. Moreover, by the time he is headed toward death, 1867, 1868, white supremacist terror is already taking hold in the post-war South. And African Americans and loyal whites are being killed by the score. And Stevens is very much aware of this fact. There are huge white riots directed against African Americans in one place after another in the former Confederacy. Stevens is moving might and main to try to force the federal government to suppress this white terror, but with mixed results. And Andrew Johnson is blocking him at every point where Johnson can do so. And Stevens feels that he is not accomplishing the goals that he set out to achieve.
He spends his last days, I call them his dying days, he's in terrible health, trying, well, they do impeach Andrew Johnson, and then he's a floor manager, isn't he, in the Senate impeachment trial. He would die shortly after that.
Yes, within a few months. In fact, that whole story has all sorts of parallels to our modern situation, because what impeachment is for and what impeachment was about and on what grounds you can impeach a president was as controversial then as it is today. Thaddeus Stevens believed that president didn't have to commit a specific crime in order to be impeached. But if he abused his office and if he failed to carry out the requirements of his office, that was adequate basis for removing someone from office. And he argued that repeatedly. His colleagues in general embraced a narrower interpretation. And so he was, again, as usual, fighting against the stream in the course of this struggle. Still, the House finally does impeach Johnson, as you say, and Stevens and his prosecutors come within one vote in the United States Senate of removing Johnson from office. And he fails to do so because the moderates will not support him.
Bruce Levine has been our guest. Bruce Levine is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He has joined us to talk about his book, Thaddeus Stevens, Civil War Revolutionary, Fighter for Racial Justice. Bruce Levine, I found that wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on, Mitch.